In the beginning, there was water. Before the first cities rose from clay and stone, before the first word was carved into wet tablets, before fire met bronze, there was the sea, wide, eternal, unfathomable. It did not whisper. It breathed. And to the ancients who stood barefoot at the edge of its restless skin, it was more than a force of nature. It was the mouth of the world, a threshold, a god. Long before science charted the depths and clocks divided time, people looked to the ocean as they looked to the stars. Not just as a source of food or danger, but as a mirror, reflecting something larger, something cosmic. They named the winds. They told stories of the tide's hunger and the moon's pull, of spirits dwelling beneath the waves, their eyes made of salt and storm. In nearly every culture that touched water, the sea was the place where life began and where it would end. To walk the shore was to walk the boundary between the known and the unknown. The sand beneath your feet was familiar. But the horizon? That was a riddle no man could answer. And so, as myths rose from firelit circles and lips shaped gods from the wind, the sea entered every origin story. In Babylon, it was Tiamat, the saltwater chaos dragon slain by Marduk to create the world. In Egypt, it was the primeval waters of Nun from which the first mound emerged. In Polynesia, it was Tangaroa, the god whose breath filled the ocean with motion. Break time equals 0. 25s /. And always, somewhere in these stories, there was a swirl, a spiral, a whirlpool, a reminder that not all water is still. That beneath the surface lies a hunger that turns in on itself, a spiral path not just downward, but inward, toward mystery, toward death, toward the sacred unknown. The whirlpool was not just a feature of sea travel. It was a symbol of destruction, yes, of sudden doom, the way a calm voyage could end in a thunderous spiral, but also of rebirth, the circle that feeds itself, the eye of the storm, spinning around a stillness no man could reach. Before ships, there were rafts. Before maps, there were stars. And before warnings, there were stories. Stories whispered by firelight of the maelstrom that swallowed whole fleets, of monsters that twisted water into spiraling traps, of divine punishments that spun travelers into the underworld. The whirlpool was the mouth of gods displeased. It was the path to Hades. It was the drain through which the world's sins were pulled back into chaos. Yet still, people sailed. Humanity, ever curious, ever foolish, pressed boats against horizon after horizon. They braved eddies and currents, read the flight of gulls and the moods of waves. In time, they gave names to the dangers: Scylla, Charybdis, Maelstrom. They inked them onto maps, not as scientific features, but as warnings etched in myth. We know now that whirlpools form where opposing currents collide, where tide meets channel, where underwater ridges twist water into spirals. But the ancient minds saw more. They saw eyes, mouths, portals. They saw the sea watching, waiting, asking. In temple carvings and painted amphorae, whirlpools appear like spiraling suns or coiled snakes. Not passive, but alive. Spirals mark transformation in many cultures, the path from life to death, from ignorance to knowledge, from flesh to spirit. And so it was with water. The sea did not just take sailors, it remade them. To survive a whirlpool was to be reborn. To be claimed by it was to be initiated into mystery. Even today, something primal stirs in us when we look at a whirlpool. A fear older than maps. A memory in the bones. Because we have always lived near water. Because we have always lost people to it. Because in the spiral, we see time. We see return. We see that nothing truly disappears, it only descends. And what descends may yet rise again. From the shores of ancient Sumer to the fjords of Norway, from the coral atolls of the Pacific to the rocky straits of Sicily, humanity has stood watchful at the edge of the sea. Always wondering, always listening, and always telling stories. Stories not just of waves and winds, but but of swirling mouths that devour and transform, of oceanic gates that open to the gods. As we begin this journey through time and myth, across continents and oceans, let us return to the spiral. Let us descend into the eye. For in the whirlpool lies the memory of our oldest fears, and perhaps our deepest truths. Before there were names, there were motions. The earth turned, the stars wheeled above, and the waters danced in spirals, drawn by hidden hands of gravity, wind, and tide. Whirlpools, those circling mouths of the sea, existed long before men carved boats or dared to cross the edge of the land. They were not born from fear or fable, but from the quiet laws that stitched the universe together. A whirlpool forms where forces meet in resistance, a fast-moving current clashing with a slower one. A tidal surge funneled through a narrow strait, the uneven terrain of the seabed bending flow into curl. It is nature's compromise, a spiral, not as chaos, but as balance, as rhythm. But the ancients did not see in swirls a set of equations. They saw meaning. They saw spirit. The whirlpool was not merely water circling upon itself. It was the sea turning to speak, to open its eye and watch the sky. In the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved their seasonal paths, people knew water as both giver and destroyer. It irrigated the fields and swallowed the cities. The early Sumerians, keen observers of the heavens and the floodplain, saw order in the spiral. Their ziggurats mirrored the step-like rise of creation, a geometric echo of the coiled forces below. They told of the Abzu, the primordial sea beneath the earth, where the god Enki ruled from a swirling abyss of sweet water. To the Egyptians, water was the great womb. Out of none, the infinite ocean of chaos, rose the first land. It is said that the swirling waters receded to reveal the Benben stone, the mound on which Adam, the first god, stood to breathe the world into being. In their temples, spiral motifs weren't just artistic. They were sacred geometry. They told of birth from nothingness. Across the ancient world, the spiral became a common shape in pottery, art, and architecture, not because it was easy to draw, but because it symbolized power in motion. From the Neolithic spirals carved into the stones of Newgrange in Ireland, to the coils in Andean textiles, the same language appeared. The spiral was life, death, time, and the unseen pull of the universe. And beneath this symbolic language, whirlpools continued to churn. Silent, persistent, they drew in flotsam and foam, sometimes ships, sometimes lives. Mariners feared them not because they didn't understand them, but because they did. They knew the ocean remembered. It remembered every oar that pierced its surface, every storm that came uninvited. And in the spiral, it stored its memory. As Bronze Age sailors began venturing farther into open water, across the Aegean, through the Red Sea, along the coast of the Indus, their stories of whirlpools became more precise. Break time equals 0. 25s, / in their logics and fears, the ocean became a living map, its hazards not random, but inhabited. Where the currents narrowed or deepened, where the cliffs funneled tide into violence, there the spiral formed. And there, too, were born legends. In Phoenician lore, whispered between traders in Tyre and Carthage, whirlpools marked the gates of the world. The Western Sea, near the Pillars of Heracles, was said to harbor churning maws where ships vanished without trace. The Atlantic, vast and unknowable, began where the spiral swallows the sun. In the Indus Valley, great cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa rose beside the rivers, but their engineers understood water's moods. Their drainage systems hinted at respect, at ritual even. And their seals and motifs often featured beasts entwined or coiled, perhaps mimicking the hidden turns of the whirl. Over time, as trade grew, so too did the shared symbols of the spiral. What began as a natural phenomenon became a spiritual cipher. The whirlpool joined the pantheon of sacred patterns, like the circle and the cross. Not just as ornament, but as oracle. For what is a whirlpool, if not a question? It draws the gaze inward. It resists passage. It warns of depths where light cannot reach. And yet it dances, beautiful in its symmetry, terrifying in its silence. And so humanity learned to live with it. Not to tame it, but to navigate it. To read its swirl like a wind. To give it names, even faces. The whirlpool was made myth not because it was unreal, but because it was too real, too powerful to ignore, too mysterious to master. Even now, when satellites can scan the ocean's surface in spiraling thermal trails, we are left with awe. For the spiral remains one of nature's deepest truths. In galaxies, in fingerprints, in the swirl of hurricanes and the growth of shells, the pattern returns. The ancients may not have had physics, but they had vision. They knew that where spirals dwell, the gods are near. And so from these early whirlpools, these natural spirals drawn by the breath of the world, we turn now to the stories that grew from them. To the monsters who wore their shapes. To the mariners who sailed too close. To the lands that marked their presence in myth and stone. Where the rugged cliffs of southern Italy stretch into the Strait of Messina and the sea narrows between Sicily and the mainland, there lies a passage the ancients feared. A corridor of rock and surge, of currents that twist and tides that howl. It was here, said the Greeks, that two monsters waited in ambush, Scylla, the many-headed devourer, and Charybdis, the great whirlpool that swallowed the sea itself. To sail between them was not a choice, but a peril. One could not avoid both. To steer too close to Charybdis was to risk being drawn into the vortex, dashed against the rocks, drowned in the gulping throat of the sea. But to veer too near Scylla was to lose crew to her snapping jaws, each head pulling a man screaming from the deck. Between these twin terrors, Greek sailors passed with prayers on their lips and dread in their blood. The tale was immortalized in Homer's Odyssey, that slow-burning poem of exile and return. There, Odysseus is warned by the sorceress Circe not to confront Charybdis directly, for her whirlpool would consume even the strongest vessel. Instead, he is told to sail close to Scylla, to accept the sacrifice of a few so the many might live. It is a bitter wisdom, spoken in the language of myth but grounded in ancient seamanship. For in the real strait, strong currents do swirl. Vortices appear where the Ionian and Tyrrhenian seas meet. Underwater ridges and shifting tides create whirlpools, sometimes violent, always unpredictable. The Greeks, whose olive-dark ships crossed the Aegean and beyond, were among the first to give form to the sea's wrath. They did not view the ocean as lifeless. It breathed. It remembered. It punished and protected. Their gods lived within it, Poseidon with his trident and storms, Triton with his conch shell horn, Nereids dancing in the surf. But the sea's dangers were not only divine. They were monstrous. Scylla and Charybdis were not simply cautionary tales. They were navigational lore wrapped in mythic flesh. In their descriptions, geography and imagination blur. Scylla, with her 6 heads and 12 legs, emerges from a rocky cliff, perhaps a warning of the treacherous outcroppings that jutted into the water. Charybdis, said to dwell directly across from her, swallows the sea thrice a day, then belches it out in fury. These are the rhythms of the tides rendered mythic, their pulsing churn cast as hunger. And so, the whirlpool becomes a character. Not merely a thing to be avoided, but a being to be feared. Her presence in Greek literature marks a shift, from observing nature to personifying it. It is a pattern found across human cultures. The more uncontrollable a force, the more it is clothed in story. The Strait of Scylla and Charybdis was not alone. Across the ancient Mediterranean, sailors whispered of sea monsters and hidden currents, of islands that moved and voices that lured. But these two, one fixed in cliff, the other circling beneath, captured the imagination with terrifying clarity. To journey past them was to pass a trial. And the Greeks believed in trials. Heroes were not born of safety, but of suffering. Odysseus lost 6 men to Scylla and wept. But he passed. He endured. And so, the tale endured. The metaphor is clear. In life, as at sea, we often face the impossible passage, caught between two dangers, one swift and swallowing, the other sharp and merciless. Wisdom lies in knowing which to face, which loss we can bear. Even Roman writers, inheritors of Greek knowledge and empire, repeated the tale. Virgil in the Aeneid echoed the passage, placing Aeneas in the same peril. Roman navigators, who mapped the seas with military precision, still revered the myths that cloaked their waters. For all their roads and rule, they knew the sea was older than empire. Today, the Strait of Messina remains restless. Its waters churn, its winds shift, its currents defy certainty. The rocks still stand, and on quiet days, locals still tell of the monsters beneath. Science can explain the eddies now, but mystery lingers like mist over the waves. In this Greek tale, the whirlpool was not just a hazard, it was a test of character. It asked, what will you give to pass through? What price will you pay for your journey home? As we leave behind Homer's haunted waters, we journey north, to colder seas and darker legends. There, where fjords carve the coast and longships split the mist, whirlpools gain a new name. A name that echoes with thunder and ice. In the gray and frigid reaches of the north, where the sun lingers low and the sea breathes mist, there lies a sound that has swallowed ships and stories alike. Its name, whispered by the Norse, thundered by waves and feared by every seafarer who dared the Scandinavian coasts, is Maelstrom. A name born from two old Dutch words, malen, to grind, and stroom, stream. The grinding stream. A title that does not whisper, but gnashes. Maelstrom was no mere legend. It was a place, a force, a living spiral of water that rose and fell with the tides in the Saltstraumen and the Moskstraumen, off the coasts of northern Norway and the Lofoten Islands. These were not metaphorical maws. They were real. Even today, the Saltstraumen is among the strongest tidal currents on Earth. Rivers of seawater squeezing through narrow straits at speeds exceeding 20 knots, twisting into foaming spirals dozens of feet wide. To the Vikings, who carved their longships from oak and set sail beneath skies of iron, the sea was more than a road, it was a soul. It had moods and hungers. It carried gods and drowned kings. Their myths, sharp as wind-blown runes, spoke of Jormungandr, the world's serpent who coiled the oceans, whose stirrings caused storms, and whose breath fouled the air. It is not hard to imagine how the sight of a great whirlpool, circling endlessly in the sea, became an eye for such a beast. The Norse saw spirals as symbols of time and fate. Their world was cyclical. Ragnarok, the end, was not final, but part of a loop, destruction birthing renewal. And in this way, the whirlpool fit perfectly into their cosmic order. A natural rune upon the ocean's surface. Sailors of the north told of ships pulled beneath the waves, of masts sucked downward like straws in ale, of sudden vanishings, where moments before there had been laughter, firelight, and song. The maelstrom needed no face, it was a mouth. Grinding. Waiting. Remembering. It was not only Norse poets who gave it voice. The legend of the maelstrom sailed far. By the medieval period, European maps began marking its place near the Lofoten coast. It appeared in sailors' tales, in scientific speculation, in the wild imagining of men who feared what they could not map. In the 17th century, the great cartographer Mercator marked a whirlpool at the North Pole itself, a magnetic maelstrom, spiraling in the center of the world. This was the age of growing knowledge, and yet still, the spiral resisted explanation. It endured as mystery. It invited awe. Writers of later centuries found inspiration in it. Edgar Allan Poe, in his 1841 tale A Descent into the Maelstrom, described a man caught in its spiral, saved not by strength, but by understanding. The deeper he was drawn into the whirlpool, the more he realized the logic within its fury. Certain objects were destroyed, others survived. To survive was not to fight, but to read the current, to surrender in knowledge. The story was fiction, but the whirlpool was not. The real maelstrom, Saltstraumen and Moskstraumen, continue to turn, governed by the cold breath of the moon, the shape of the seabed, and the meeting of tides. Even in our age of sonar and satellite, they resist full taming. Boats still wait for the right moment to pass. Fishermen still read the eddies like scripture. For all their seafaring prowess, the Norse never claimed to master the ocean. Their gods themselves were often drowned or swallowed. What they prized was courage in the face of the unknowable. To pass the maelstrom was to challenge fate and honor the sea's authority. Not in arrogance, but in reverence. The whirlpool, then, became a test of wisdom. To rush toward it blindly was suicide. But to study its pattern, to time one's passage, to move with the spiral, not against it, that was the mark of the true mariner. This ethos lives on. In modern Norway, the whirlpools remain a tourist marvel and a seaman's trial. Pilots calculate their force. Researchers model their behavior. But still, when the tide turns and the sea draws inward, a hush falls. Because in the roar of the maelstrom, something ancient speaks. Something that predates myth and survives science. A voice of the earth, saying, "All that rises must turn." From the icy whirlpools of the north, we now descend into warmer seas, but no less treacherous. For in the shadow of empire, whirlpools remained alive, not just in the water, but in the minds of those who sailed for conquest and trade. Beneath the steady gaze of empire, where aqueducts arched like ribs across valleys and roads stretched like veins toward every edge of the known world, the sea remained a space of contradiction. To Rome, the ocean was both bridge and abyss. It connected provinces, carried grain, wine, soldiers, laws. Yet it also stirred with old gods, inherited myths, and inherited fears, none more enduring than that of the whirlpool. The Romans, ever practical and precise, mapped the world with measured certainty. But even their maps bowed to mystery when it came to the Strait of Messina. The narrow ribbon of water between Sicily and the Italian mainland, where Charybdis, the ancient monster of the whirlpool, still lingered in both tail and tide. By the time Rome came to power, Greek myth had long been absorbed into Roman life. Charybdis, once the ravenous daughter of Poseidon who swallowed seas and spewed them back in terrifying floods, was no longer just story. She was a known hazard, feared by sailors and charted by scholars. The strait's peculiar tidal behavior, shaped by complex underwater topography and opposing currents, gave real teeth to the myth. Vortices would form, boats would spin, and in the wrong conditions, ships could be dashed against rocks or dragged under entirely. Roman authors did not shy from this. Pliny the Elder wrote in Natural History about the perils of the strait, blending observation with awe. Break time equals 0. 25s / for Pliny and his peers. Whirlpools were not only natural phenomena, but reminders of human fragility before the forces of nature. Even Caesar himself, in his writings on the Gallic Wars, noted how tides and ocean swirls complicated movement and strategy, especially along the British coasts. And yet, the Romans did not retreat from these watery threats. They conquered the sea by engineering harbors, deploying galleys, and maintaining lines of maritime trade that spanned from Iberia to Judea. To do this, they learned to respect the ocean's dangers, not as superstitions, but as facts of life. Still, the mythic lived on in the margins. Roman poets like Virgil and Ovid carried Charybdis forward, her name echoing in the journeys of Aeneas, the mythic forefather of Rome, whose ships too were nearly lost to her. In these retellings, Charybdis became more than a hazard, she was a moral challenge. To sail between Scylla and Charybdis, as Aeneas did, became symbolic, the choice between two evils, the narrow path through catastrophe. This metaphor outlived empire. Even today, to be between Scylla and Charybdis means to face a perilous dilemma. And this expression, born of a whirlpool, reveals something essential, that the deep currents of myth flow beneath even the most rational of civilizations. In time, Roman sailors, merchants, and fishermen developed techniques to read the whirlpools, not through divine guidance, but through lived experience. They watched the moon, studied the tides, adjusted their sails. They passed down sea lore not as poetry, but as practice. Yet even then, at night, when the stars spun overhead and the sea pulsed black beneath their keels, it was easy to believe that something larger stirred below. For all Rome's advances in law, architecture, and administration, its people remained attuned to the sacred in the natural world. Springs had nymphs, thunderhead gods, and whirlpools, those great devourers, were still mouths of ancient hunger watched with wary eyes. When the empire fell and the world plunged into new uncertainties, these myths did not die. They transformed. They passed into the hands of monks, sailors, pilgrims. The whirlpool of Messina still churned, and its story, like the sea itself, refused to be stilled. As we leave behind the disciplined fleets of Rome, our journey flows onward, into waters even more symbolic, where ocean and soul merge into one. For the whirlpool, once a predator of ships, becomes something more, a gate to the unknown, a mirror of the spirit's descent. In the lands where morning breaks earliest upon the waters, where dragons are born from waves and silence hangs deep like mist over mountains, the ocean was never merely sea, it was spirit. Here, in the east, whirlpools were not simply dangers to avoid, but symbols to contemplate. Their spiraling forms were more than turbulence. They were echoes of the cosmos, of mind and matter, of samsara and release. Across the islands of Japan, where cliffs stand like folded paper and pine trees curl against the wind, there lies one of the most feared and revered whirlpools in the world, the Naruto whirlpools. Break time equals 0. 25s / in the narrow strait between Awaji Island and Shikoku. Twice each day, as tides shift between the Seto Inland Sea and the Pacific, the sea churns into a ballet of eddies, some growing large enough to pull even fishing boats from their course. And yet, unlike Charybdis, Naruto was never a monster, never a mouth to flee, but a movement to be watched, measured, and understood. In Shinto tradition, nature is divine, and every place, tree, stone, storm, or sea, holds a kami, a spirit. The Naruto whirlpools were no exception. They were not feared as omens of doom, but honored as part of the great living body of nature. Like breath inhaled and exhaled from the sea itself, these spirals of water marked the turning of time, the pulse of the world's body. The whirlpool here became a metaphor that spun into Japanese art, literature, and belief. Break time equals 0. 25s / the spiral, Uzumaki, appears again and again, from woodblock prints of swirling waves to the curling patterns on samurai armor and temple carvings. It symbolized motion, life, growth, death, and rebirth. The very act of circling, of never reaching a point but endlessly turning, was sacred. Like the Buddhist wheel of Dharma, or the spiral of meditation descending into the soul, the whirlpool in Eastern tradition was not a predator, it was a teacher. Buddhism, carried across Asia by foot and sail, spoke of the sea not as enemy, but as mirror. In its depths, one might glimpse illusion and truth intertwined. The whirlpool, ever drawing downward, became an image of samsara, the cycle of suffering and rebirth. To fall into it was to fall into ignorance, desire, attachment. But in the act of recognition, in stillness at the center of the storm, there was a way out. Chinese cosmology, too, knew the spiral, not as whirlpool alone, but as the curve of time and balance. The Tao, the way, flowed like water, circling obstacles, moving always forward yet never direct. The yin and yang themselves spin in eternal rotation, like opposing currents meeting. The whirlpool here was not disorder, it was the pattern of duality. The pull of the world's forces, caught in harmonious swirl. Sailors in these eastern waters told tales not of beasts, but of blessings and dangers in equal measure. The vortex was a place where ancestors might speak, where dragons might rise, where offerings to the ocean might disappear, taken to some spirit realm beneath the tide. Some legends even claim that beneath the largest whirlpools lay hidden cities of the drowned, or celestial gates through which the soul might pass. There is an ancient tale, whispered from Korea to Japan, of a monk who meditated beside a great whirlpool for 99 days. Each morning, he saw the tide pull inward, the spiral tighten, then vanish. Each night, it returned. On the final day, it is said, he threw himself into the heart of the vortex, not from despair, but from surrender. He did not drown. He descended. And in the depthless silence, he saw the turning wheel of the cosmos itself, and emerged a sage. Perhaps the most profound truth of the whirlpool in Eastern philosophy is that it is not the enemy of the boat, but the mirror of the soul. It does not demand avoidance. It demands awareness. For what it swallows, it does not destroy. It transforms. In a world increasingly obsessed with control and conquest, the Eastern approach reminds us, not all chaos must be conquered. Some whirlpools must be watched, not feared. Some must be entered, not escaped. Some spirals do not pull us down, but inward. As we drift westward once more, into the age of maps and compasses, a new kind of whirlpool awaits us, one wrapped not in gods or ghosts, but in calculation, curiosity, and growing awe. Beyond the familiar myths of sirens and sea monsters, beyond the ink-smeared edges of medieval maps, there arose a new kind of fear, one not rooted in gods, but in the silence of instruments and the vanishing of logic. In the centuries where human beings began to measure the world with sextants and telescopes, they also began to notice the world slipping through their fingers in places they could not explain. Whirlpools had long been symbols of mystery, but now, in the modern age, they became the heart of two of Earth's most enigmatic maritime zones, the Devil's Sea of the Pacific and the Bermuda Triangle of the Atlantic. Off the southeastern coast of the United States, where the warm Gulf Stream churns like a living river through deep sapphire waters, the Bermuda Triangle formed its quiet grip on the imagination of the Western world. Between the points of Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, this vast maritime corridor gained a reputation not for visible whirlpools, but for disappearances. Planes that vanished from radar. Ships that were never seen again. Compasses that spun like dancers out of rhythm. Unlike the swirling waters of Charybdis or Naruto, the vortex here was invisible, its pull psychological as much as physical. The 1945 vanishing of Flight 19, 5 U.S. Navy bombers on a training mission, marked the Triangle's entry into modern legend. The pilot's last transmission spoke of disorientation. We can't find West. Everything is wrong. Hours later, the rescue plane dispatched to find them also vanished. And from that moment, the Atlantic grew a myth not born of mythmakers, but of newsmen, pilots, and skeptics turned believers. A similar silence blankets the Devil's Sea, Ma-no Omi, off the coast of Japan, east of the Philippines. Like its Atlantic twin, it too is a place of vanished vessels, lost fishermen, and strange magnetic anomalies. In Japanese folklore, it was said to be cursed, haunted by ancient spirits or guarded by sea dragons still coiled beneath the waves. In the 1950s, 9 ships reportedly vanished in the region without distress signals. It was enough for the Japanese government to declare the area officially dangerous for maritime traffic, a rare acknowledgement of the unknown in an age of data. But what if the whirlpool had evolved? No longer a visible spiral of sea, but a convergence of natural forces, currents, winds, magnetic fields, methane eruptions, rogue waves, and optical illusions? Oceanographers studying both regions began to trace patterns in the chaos. Some believed the warm water of the Gulf Stream in the Bermuda Triangle, combined with undersea topography, created sudden squalls and wave patterns that could overwhelm a vessel in minutes. Others looked beneath the sea floor, pointing to pockets of methane hydrate that, when released, might destabilize the buoyancy of a ship. Even magnetism had its role to play. Compasses near the equator follow true magnetic north, but in certain areas, like the Bermuda Triangle, natural variations in the Earth's magnetic field can cause instruments to deviate without warning. The sea, long feared for its strength, now revealed its subtlety. Not just in waves that rise, but in the invisible arms that twist the logic of human tools. Still, these theories, however rational, could not erase the stories. Nor could they dull the sense of reverence. In the Triangle, as in the Devil's Sea, there remains something unsaid, something that resists graphs and equations. The modern mind, no less than the ancient, still stares at vanishing points on maps and wonders, not only what lies there, but why it is hidden. The whirlpool, then, has changed form, but not function. Where once it was a visible maw in the sea, now it is a vortex of doubt, an absence around which theories orbit like stars around a black hole. We measure it in lost coordinates, in final messages, in ships recovered empty and planes erased. But perhaps the whirlpool's true power lies not in destruction, but in suggestion. It hints. It withdraws. It pulls not the hull but the mind. And so, in these modern mysteries, the ancient awe still flickers. Beneath every rational explanation lies a whisper of the unknown. The ocean remains a mirror we cannot fully gaze into, and the whirlpool, visible or not, remains the symbol of what we cannot control. As our journey deepens, we turn next to the world beneath these waters, to the submerged landscapes that once stood above sea level, now swallowed whole. For even cities have vanished into the sea, their ruins circled by eddies, their stones perhaps the seeds of myth. Beneath the weight of waves and the hush of centuries, cities sleep. Their columns, once lit by fire and sun, now glow in the eerie light that filters through seawater. Their streets, once echoing with sandals, carts, and prayers, are now trodden by fish and dusted with silt. These are not ruins abandoned by war or flame. These are cities claimed by the sea. And where they fell, the whirlpools whisper still. Long before modern coastlines took their shape, sea levels rose and fell like breath. Tectonic plates shifted in slow violence. Tsunamis surged with sudden fury. Earthquakes broke the spine of continents. And cities, built by hands that believed in permanence, were dragged beneath. To dive into their remains is to descend through time, into chambers where air once lived, into temples whose gods drowned. Off the coast of Egypt, near the mouth of the Nile, lies a city that disappeared for over 1,000 years, Heracleon. Once a mighty port before Alexandria, it was a threshold between worlds, where Greeks met Egyptians and gods wore dual names. Temples to Amunias-Jerub, colossal statues of pharaohs, and stone stele carved with laws now lie scattered across the seabed. Discovered in the early 2000s by underwater archaeologists, Heracleon emerged from silt like a dream reborn. Entire neighborhoods lie preserved, their walls still bearing the faint marks of tools. Gold coins, incense burners, and oil lamps wait patiently among sea grasses. The sea, here, was not merely devourer, but preserver. The Nile Delta, heavy with sediment, blanketed the city as it sank, burying it, but also cradling it from erosion. Scientists believe a combination of rising water tables, soil liquefaction, and earthquakes caused Heracleon to subside. But legends had spoken of its fall for centuries, calling it the city of vanished offerings, where a whirlpool once pulled down the barges of priests. Myth and geology had danced together again. Far to the west, in the blue cradle between Greece and Africa, another city sleeps, Pavlopetri. Off the coast of Laconia, submerged just 4 meters below the surface, lie the streets and courtyards of a Bronze Age town over 5,000 years old. It is the oldest known submerged city in the world. There are homes with multiple rooms, roads with gutters, and large public spaces that hint at gatherings and trade. Pottery fragments, some Minoan, some Mycenaean, murmur of long-forgotten rituals and family life. Unlike Heraclean, Pavlopetri's fate came slowly, as sea levels crept upward and seismic activity weakened the coastline. No whirlpool swallowed it whole. Yet the image remains, a city fading into the sea, like ink into paper, one brushstroke at a time. What conversations once echoed in those stone rooms? What lullabies drifted up from its doorways on warm evenings? The whirlpool as symbol lingers, even when not seen. In the Gulf of Khumbat, off India's western coast, sonar scans in the early 2000s revealed what some believe to be the remnants of ancient cities, possibly over 9,000 years old. Rectilinear patterns, structures aligned with cardinal directions, and evidence of habitation challenge our timelines. Though debated fiercely, they stir the imagination. Could this be the seed of mythologies like Dvarka, the submerged city of Krishna? Could it be one of many Atlantean echoes scattered across the globe? Whether submerged by flood, earthquake, or time itself, these cities bear silent witness to humanity's vulnerability. No matter how advanced the architecture, no matter how sacred the temple or proud the wall, all crumble before the slow pull of the earth's breath and the patient hand of the sea. And yet, there is beauty in the loss. Divers descend into crystal silence and touch what was once touched by citizens long buried. They see stairs that once rose toward open air, now leading only into shimmering blue. The present hand reaches into the past's pulse. In doing so, we rediscover what we thought was lost, not only ruins, but wonder. The sea does not take maliciously. It reclaims. And in that reclamation, it preserves stories in silence, like seeds beneath frost. Perhaps the whirlpool is not only a destroyer, but a portal. A spinning doorway between eras, where one world falls into another and waits to be remembered. As we rise from these depths, water streaming from ancient steps, we return to the realm of legend, where the whirlpool was not just a natural force or metaphor, but a gateway to hidden lands. The stories now take us to the horizon of imagination itself. Where the map ends and the sea grows strange, imagination begins. In the ancient mind, not all whirlpools were prisons of death. Some were keys. Spiraling gates through which souls could pass, ships could vanish, and gods could whisper. To look into a vortex was to peer into the eye of the unknown, a threshold not only between life and death, but between worlds. In Norse sagas, the sea was not flat and finite. It was a serpent coil. At the edge of Midgard, the human realm, the ocean spiraled into Jormungandr, the great world serpent. His body circled the earth, tail in mouth. And in his stirrings, storms were born. But what lay beyond his coiled grip? There were whispers of another realm, hidden in the whirl, in the sink of tides too wild to cross. Ancient Greek texts spoke not only of Charybdis, the devouring maw, but of realms below her swirl. Some poets imagined it as a passage to the underworld. Not Hades in fire and shadow, but an oceanic afterlife, lit by bioluminescent dreams. Others saw the whirlpool as a metaphor for the soul's descent and return, spiraling into mystery before emerging again, reborn. In the East, Chinese mythology described whirlpools as portals between dimensions. In Taoist texts, the sea was filled with dragon whirlpools, spinning doors through which immortals could pass unseen. The legend of Penglai, the island of immortality, was not anchored in one location. It shifted, moved by tides, appearing only to those pure of heart or wise of eye. Some said it was hidden beyond a vortex, accessible only when the sea itself allowed. In Polynesian tradition, navigators sailed by stars, wind, and wave. But they also believed in places that lay beyond known sea routes. Floating paradises where ancestors dwelled. These were not just metaphors. Some voyagers claimed to have been drawn into swirling seas, lost to time, then returned changed. The vortex was not death, it was a test, a rite of passage. And perhaps the most enduring tale of all comes from the West, Atlantis. A city, or a continent, or a memory, its form changes with each telling. Plato spoke of it as a place of unimaginable wealth and knowledge, destroyed in a single night and day by earthquake and flood. But some later interpreters insisted it did not merely sink. It passed through, swallowed not by water alone, but by a rift, a whirlpool that spun it into another plane. Could such stories be remnants of something half-remembered? Could ancient peoples, watching ships vanish into storm and tide, imagine not just destruction, but transformation? Could they sense, in the spiral, not only chaos, but possibility? Modern theorists have not abandoned the dream. Fringe science speaks of vortex anomalies, regions on Earth where gravity behaves strangely, compasses spin wildly, and electromagnetic fields bend. The Bermuda Triangle is perhaps the most infamous. A triangle not of geometry alone, but of vanished vessels, lost pilots, and broken radios. Some call it pseudoscience. Others say we simply do not yet understand the rules. In these vortex legends, time often bends. There are sailors who enter a storm and emerge decades later, unchanged. There are pilots who lose hours, only to find their watches untouched. There are fishermen who, pulled down by whirlpools, return with tales of glowing cities and soft voices in the deep. Whether real or imagined, the vortex captures a human truth, that the unknown is not merely frightening, it is alluring. The whirlpool tempts us not only with danger, but with the promise that there might be more. That beyond the spin lies something ancient, or future, or eternal. And so, we return to the sea's spiral not to escape, but to seek. Each myth, each story, is a boat cast into the swirl. And we, watchers, dreamers, wanderers, are all passengers. To step into the eye of a whirlpool is to surrender not only to the sea, but to the shape of a question without an answer. For millennia, humans have gazed upon the spiraling water with both terror and longing, sensing that within its turning walls lies something more than current and collapse. Some fled its pull, but others, drawn by something deeper than reason, set sail into the very vortex itself. There are stories, half buried in logbooks and half entombed in oral tradition, of those who chased the whirlpool. Not to escape, but to encounter. Among them were men of science and sailors of faith, mystics, cartographers, and madmen, each guided by the belief that within chaos might lie a secret kept from the still world. In the early 17th century, there were tales of a mariner named Captain Vassal, whose ship vanished near the coasts of Norway while charting the Moskenstraumen. His crew returned with a broken mast and strange stories, of water that spun like a mirror, of voices heard below, and of stars that flickered during daylight. They spoke of descending into a spiral not unlike a tunnel, a place where the rules of movement changed. One sailor claimed he saw ships, ancient and barnacled, hovering motionless within the turning ring. Another, wide-eyed and silent, never spoke again. A century later, during the Enlightenment, a scholar named Antoine Lefebvre compiled accounts of strange ocean phenomena, traveling across ports from Brittany to Morocco. In a battered notebook he called Notes on the Unstill Sea, he catalogued whispers. A lighthouse keeper who watched a boat pulled into the sea with no splash, a fisherman who returned speaking fluent Greek though he had never learned it, and a child who dreamed nightly of a blue spiral that taught him numbers beyond counting. But not all seekers survived. In 1852, the whaling ship Odalisque disappeared in calm waters off the coast of Newfoundland. The sea was still, the sky clear. Yet local Mi'kmaq legends had long warned of an invisible current in those parts, a place where the sea would suddenly open like an eye. No wreckage was found. Only, weeks later, a sailor's journal washed ashore, water-stained but legible. It spoke of a fog that fell in a single breath, of compass needles trembling in opposite directions, and of laughter, not human, echoing from the deep. And then there were those who sought the vortex not for legend or proof, but for transformation. In Eastern mystic traditions, some believed that meditating near coastal whirlpools could bring the soul closer to enlightenment. The spiral, in sacred geometry, is the path of growth, the Nautilus, the galaxy, the hurricane. To enter it spiritually was to align with the turning wheel of the universe. In Japan's Naruto Strait, Buddhist monks were known to meditate on cliffside rocks overlooking the maelstrom, believing that the constant turning reflected the impermanence of all things. To watch the water was to witness time itself unravel and reform endlessly. They called it Yuzu no Michi, the path of the vortex. But what of the mind? Psychologists of the modern age suggest that the whirlpool, in myth and experience, mirrors a journey inward, the descent into the unconscious. In dreams, spirals represent returning to the origin, to memory, to trauma or truth. To those who dared sail into one, willingly or not, what did they find in the turning dark? Could the stories of luminous realms, of clocks that ran backward, of ships that reappeared unchanged after decades, could these be reflections not of the ocean's secrets, but of the soul's? Technology, too, reached into the whirl. In the 20th century, submersibles explored regions of turbulent flow and deep-sea anomalies. Some found nothing but turbulence and pressure. Others reported unusual readings, bubbles of warmth, cavitating currents, or sudden drops in light even where water should not dim it. Break time equals 0. 25s / data piled. Yet the mystery remained, not in what was found, but in what persisted just beyond reach. Into the whirlpool went the brave and the broken, the visionary and the lost. Some sought Atlantis, others transcendence. A few returned. Fewer spoke. And so the eye of the storm remains open. It is not merely weather or water. It is invitation. Across the mythologies of many ancient worlds, the sea is not merely a canvas of exploration or mystery. It is also a tribunal. When the waters swirl and spiral with violent intent, it is often said they are not moved by wind or current alone, but by judgment. The whirlpool, in this light, becomes not a door to knowledge, but a prison without bars, an executioner masked as a natural force. It is the earth's way of dragging the condemned back into its cold, fluid womb. In Greek mythology, the punishment of the whirlpool was made manifest through Charybdis. She was no mere creature, but a symbol of insatiable hunger, an eternal spiral created by Zeus to embody the consequences of theft and pride. Some legends say she had once been a sea goddess herself, daughter of Poseidon, who dared to flood lands in her father's name. For this, Zeus struck her down, casting her into the sea and binding her spirit to the tides. 3 times a day she would drink the ocean, and 3 times she would vomit it back, forming the terrifying vortex that swallowed ships whole. Sailors who passed through the Strait of Messina knew the tale well. Between the rocky dangers of Scylla and the ever-churning maw of Charybdis, they had little choice but to face one form of doom. The spiral of Charybdis was not random. It was wrath, transformed. And when a ship was lost there, it was whispered that the ocean had passed sentence. Beyond Greece, punishment by whirlpool took other forms. In Norse tradition, the maelstrom was sometimes seen as the mouth of Jormungandr, the world serpent. Coiled beneath the ocean, this giant creature circled Midgard, and when it stirred, the seas trembled. Some believed that those who betrayed their kin or defied the gods would be drawn toward the serpent's yawning maw, never to return. Their final trial would be to face the beast not in battle, but in the pull of its tail's wake. In parts of Polynesia, where oral tales drifted like coral seeds from island to island, whirlpools were the burial grounds of broken oaths. One legend from Samoa tells of a high chief who broke a sacred promise to the sea goddess Nephanua. As penance, a great spiral was born in the waters outside his village. From that day forward, no canoe dared venture near, for fear that the goddess would reclaim her due. Locals claimed to hear drums from beneath the waves, as if a ghostly fleet still danced in the depths. The Aztecs, too, spoke of watery judgment. In their layered cosmology, water was both life-giver and destroyer. The god Tlaloc, bringer of rain and floods, was not a gentle deity. Whirlpools were among his tools of purification. Sacrifices, often children, were made to appease him, and when the water churned unnaturally in Lake Texcoco or the rivers of the Valley of Mexico, priests would murmur that Tlaloc had grown hungry again. Even in Christian lore, echoes of the spiral as punishment persist. Medieval maps, like the Mappa Mundi, sometimes showed sea monsters or mysterious spirals at the edges of the known world. These were not mere cartographic embellishments. They served as moral warnings, straying too far, seeking forbidden lands, or pursuing knowledge not meant for man, might earn divine wrath in the form of watery ruin. In these traditions, the whirlpool is not just a thing of physics, it is consequence. A visual echo of the spiral downward that comes with betrayal, pride, greed, or transgression. It is hell-made fluid. The sea becomes judge and executioner. But beneath these mythic judgments lies a deeper question. Did ancient peoples invent these tales because of the whirlpools, or did they recognize, within the shape of the spiral, something universal about guilt and retribution? Like a conscience that returns again and again, never resting, the whirlpool reflects the soul's endless turn toward the wrongs of the past. Even in our time, the metaphor endures. We speak of being sucked into despair or temptation, of lives spiraling out of control. We use the language of water to describe moral collapse. Is it because, deep down, we still believe in the punishment of the sea? Some modern scholars believe these tales reflect an older psychological truth, the fear that nature itself keeps score, that the world remembers our trespasses, that somewhere, in the churn of the ocean, our misdeeds are accounted and collected. As night falls over the ancient straits and forgotten coves where whirlpools once claimed ships and stories, the silence feels watchful. The spiral sleeps, perhaps. But punishment, in these tales, is never gone, only waiting. Long before mathematics named it, before sailors feared it and stories cursed it, the spiral was drawn in quiet reverence onto cave walls, pottery, and stone. It was not a symbol of death, but of life. Not destruction, but growth. In cultures from every corner of the ancient world, the spiral became a sacred shape, a reflection of the soul's journey, the breath of nature, and the unseen patterns guiding the universe. The spiral, after all, is everywhere. In the curl of a wave, the roll of a snail's shell, the tender unfurling of a fern, the wind-carved galaxies above. It is how the world builds itself, inward and outward, circling but never returning quite the same. To the ancient mind, this was not coincidence. It was divine rhythm. In Neolithic Europe, the spiral appeared again and again in stone carvings, especially at sacred sites like Newgrange in Ireland. There, great triple spirals were etched into the entrance stones of burial mounds aligned with the rising sun of the winter solstice. When the first rays of light entered the passage once a year, it was as if life itself was drawn from the earth in a sacred spiral of fire and rebirth. To the people who raised those stones, the spiral was not chaos. Break time equals 0. 25s, / it was continuity. In the Andes, the Inca and their predecessors used spiral motifs to represent water, the giver of life in dry mountain realms. Their fountains curled in snail-shell spirals, channeling precious runoff from snow-capped peaks. To them, the spiral was not threatening. It was motion without violence, flow without loss. In the Maori traditions of Aotearoa, New Zealand, the koru, a spiral based on the newborn fern, represents new life, harmony, and balanced growth. It is found carved into meeting houses, tattooed onto skin, and painted into ceremonial artworks. The spiral here is soft, nurturing, a cradle of creation rather than a mouth of destruction. Celtic culture embraced the spiral as a sacred path. The triple spiral, or triskele, symbolized the three realms: land, sea, and sky, or life, death, and rebirth, or maiden, mother, and crone. It was a shape that could hold complexity without contradiction. A sacred dance in which all things returned, not to their beginning, but to their purpose. Even in Buddhist and Hindu art, the spiral emerges, not always in literal form, but in the swirling energy of chakras, the spiral coils of kundalini, and the mandalas whose patterns reflect the inward journey of the spirit. The soul does not travel in a straight line. It unfolds, like a shell, like a star. The Hopi people of North America saw the spiral as a migration path. Carved into canyon walls, it marked the journeys of clans through time and terrain, not as a map, but as a memory. A reminder that life is never a single line forward, but always a circling, a returning with deeper understanding. To early mystics and philosophers, the spiral was more than a symbol. It was a truth hidden in form. In the Fibonacci sequence, they glimpsed the fingerprint of nature's design. In the Nautilus shell, a logic that danced with beauty. The spiral showed that movement need not be chaotic, that growth could have grace. How curious, then, that the same shape feared in whirlpools is venerated in sacred temples. That what drags ships to their end also lifts prayers toward the heavens. Is it not the same force? The same movement? Perhaps this is the paradox ancient cultures understood. That destruction and creation were the same mask. That the spiral, depending on where you stand, is either a fall or a flight, a devouring or a birthing. The sea, ever whispering, seems to know this too. It teaches without speaking, carries without promise, pulls and releases in rhythms that echo the spiral's turning. In its depths and in its surface swirls, it holds both the threat and the truth that all things circle, that the end is not the end, only a curve, an arc, a turning. Beyond the veils of myth and metaphor, where sea monsters and gods once churned the waves, there lie real whirlpools, vortices of water born not from legend, but from geology, tide, and wind. These are not creatures, though they behave like them, spinning, devouring, dragging the sea into downward spirals. Mariners feared them for good reason. They were not just symbols of fate, they were obstacles of it. Among the most feared of these was the Moskstraumen, off the coast of Norway. Situated between the islands of Moskenesoya and Værøy in the Lofoten archipelago, this natural whirlpool is born of tidal forces where the Norwegian Sea rushes between narrow straits and underwater ridges. Its name, Maelstrom, echoes across literature and maritime lore, drawn into the pens of Poe and Verne, who saw in its turning waters a portal to the sublime and the terrifying. Fishermen avoided it. Sailors circled wide around its edges, wary of the churning mouth that seemed to breathe. The Moskstraumen is not the only one. In the narrow straits between the island of Salt Spring and Vancouver Island in Canada, the Skookumchuck Narrows, from the Chinook jargon meaning strong water, boils with fury during changing tides. Here, as many as 200 billion gallons of water pass through the passage in a single tide, producing waves that tower up to 2 meters and whirlpools that spin like turning stars. It is not a place for the careless. Further north, in the fjords of Norway again, we find Saltstraumen, the world's strongest tidal current. With waters racing at over 20 knots through a strait only 150 meters wide, it creates immense whirlpools, some of the largest known. From the air, they resemble celestial spirals etched into the ocean's skin. Tourists watch from cliffs, captivated by their elegance. But for those in small boats or fishing vessels, the elegance masks danger. Off the northern coast of Scotland lies the core of Wrekin, a deep underwater chasm between the islands of Jura and Scarba. When the Atlantic tide rushes through this narrow strait and strikes submerged pinnacles, it bursts into vertical waves and spiraling vortexes so powerful that ancient Celts said it was the lair of a sea hag. Even today, the roar of the whirlpool can be heard from miles away, a booming breath from beneath. The ancients told stories of monsters because it was the only language they had to explain such wrath. Yet the truth beneath these tales was never far from science. Whirlpools are caused by uneven tides, strong winds, and shifting seafloors. Where currents collide or funnel through narrow passages, the sea folds upon itself, descending in helical motion. The greater the difference in tide, the more forceful the spiral. Beneath the myth, there is a rhythm. Yet, even as science explained them, whirlpools continued to shape human history. Ancient trade routes were drawn and redrawn to avoid dangerous waters. Entire ships vanished, swallowed not by dragons, but by eddies and riptides. The lore persisted because the danger remained. Some believe whirlpools even influenced the outcome of wars. In narrow sea passages, like the Bosphorus, the Dardanelles, or straits along the Aegean, ships had to time their crossing with the tides. A poorly timed assault could mean disaster, as fleets drifted off course or were scattered by unpredictable swirls. And what of the great age of exploration? European mariners, armed with maps and compasses, still whispered of watery traps, places where the seas turned on themselves and ships drifted into silence. Sailors wrote of dead water, of regions where boats halted without cause, of spinning currents that tugged them off path. Often, these were not mere hallucinations. They were the invisible forces of whirlpools and eddies, powerful and slow, wearing no face but exerting real control. Not all whirlpools are grand and fearsome. Some are quiet, almost unnoticeable, gentle eddies forming behind rocks or islands. In rivers and lakes, in hidden corners of the sea, these small spirals mark the endless conversation between water and earth. The whisper before the roar. There is a beauty to them, too. In the spiral, the sea reveals its patience, turning, wearing down stone, carving new paths through time. What men call destructive, nature calls necessary. In every vortex is a quiet reordering, a reset of direction, a dissolving of certainty. Is this not what life does to us as well? And so, the ancient whirlpools still spin, not in fable alone, but in real waters, under real skies. And ships still sail over them, carried by courage, guided by knowledge, shadowed by old fears. Long before sailors traced stars and merchants carved routes across the oceans, there was another map. Etched not on parchment, but in the dreams of humankind. It was a spiritual cartography, where whirlpools were not just water and wind, but portals, judges, and devourers. They marked the edge of the known and the entrance to the sacred. In this world, to sail too close to a whirlpool was not merely to risk drowning. It was to risk passage into another existence entirely. In many ancient cultures, whirlpools were symbols of the soul's descent, spiraling downward into the underworld, the realm of ancestors, gods, and forgotten memory. The motion itself, a spinning funnel, evoked a journey from the surface of being into the depths of spirit. Death was rarely seen as a straight road. It was a spiral, a vortex, pulling the self inward, until rebirth or final stillness. In Hindu cosmology, the churning of the ocean of milk, Samudra Manthan, was the great cosmic whirlpool. Gods and demons turned the sea with a mountain as a churning rod, bringing forth both nectar and poison. This was no myth of terror, but one of transformation. The spiral movement of ocean was a divine tool, of destruction, yes, but also of renewal. In Maori tradition, the ocean whirlpool known as Te Korakoro Oti I Parata, the throat of Parata, was not just a physical force but a cosmic mouth, a place into which waters, winds, and even boats could disappear. It was not simply malevolent. It was part of the world's living structure, regulating balance, swallowing excess, and returning nothing unchanged. In Japanese Shinto thought, the spiraling vortex resembles the spiral tomo, a sacred symbol often found on temple drums and warrior crests. It represents motion, transformation, the eternal swirl of life, death, and rebirth. Whirlpools, especially those like Naruto and the Naruto Strait, were considered expressions of divine energy, neither good nor evil, but powerful, present, and worthy of respect. Across the Celtic world, spirals were everywhere, carved into stone tombs, painted on shields, etched into jewelry. The triple spiral, or triskele, mirrored not only the seasons or the phases of life, but the turning of water, the cycle of soul through realms. To drown in the sea, for the Celts, was to return to the womb of the goddess, a sacred passage through the veil. In Greek myth, we find Charybdis again, not just as a threat to sailors, but as a sole judge, one who swallowed all but spared the worthy. Her whirlpool was as much symbolic as literal, a mouth of the earth, a test of hubris. To sail past her was to confront the limits of human control and emerge, perhaps, transformed. Even in the Bible, echoes of whirlpools emerge. In the book of Jonah, the prophet is cast into the sea and swallowed by a great fish, an allegory some have tied to the maelstrom, to the oceanic descent into reflection, penance, and eventual resurrection. The spiral is not mentioned, but the shape of the journey follows the same arc, falling, waiting, rising. Among the Polynesians, where navigation was sacred and the sea a map of the soul, whirlpools marked places of mana, spiritual force. A vortex was not to be feared, but known, spoken to, honored. Some voyaging chants spoke of spirals that led to Hawaii, the ancestral homeland across the ocean where the dead returned. And what of northern Europe, where icy waters swallowed longships and thunderclouds curled above gray coasts? To the Vikings, whirlpools could be pathways to Helheim or to Rance Hall, the sea goddess who claimed the drowned. Her net was said to lie beneath the waves, invisible, waiting. And when the sea spun suddenly, pulling down the careless or the chosen, it was not chance. It was her hand. In each tradition, the spiral meant change. Whether a god's breath, a serpent's coil, a gate to the spirit world, or a symbol of time itself, the whirlpool was a sacred movement. Downward did not mean death alone. It meant passage, initiation. Perhaps that is why whirlpools haunted dreams and visions. They are not still water. They are becoming. And in becoming, they reflect something deep within us all, the wish to descend and return, to be broken and reformed, to find meaning in the spiral of life. So when the sea turns and the sky darkens, when currents twist and eddies pull, it is not just nature at work. It is myth remembering itself. And maybe, just maybe, the soul knows the way down. Beneath the glittering surface of the sea, beneath the skin of tides and the mirror of stars, lies something deeper than depth, something ancient, alive, and always turning. The whirlpool. Not just a pattern of water or a peril to sailors, but a symbol, a presence, a force that echoes through both myth and memory. For thousands of years, humans stood at the edge of land and looked out to sea. They built boats and dreams, they cast nets and prayers, and always they watched the water swirl. Whirlpools were not merely there to be avoided. They were there to be understood. To be feared, yes, but also to be revered. The spiral that forms a whirlpool is more than emotion. It is a language. It speaks of things we cannot quite say. It reflects the galaxies overhead and the shells underfoot, the eddies of wind and sand and smoke, the inward pull of memory, dream, and time. It is the shape of descent and return, the shape of forgetting and remembering. In the tales we've explored, of Charybdis and Scylla, of the Saltstraumen and the Maelstrom, of the myths of Norway, Japan, Greece, Polynesia, and beyond, whirlpools were never just geographical accidents. They were thresholds, portals, mouths of the earth. Some saw them as monsters. Others saw them as the sea's breath. Some called them traps, and others called them homes of the gods. But always, they marked a place of boundary, between safety and danger, between this world and the next, between the seen and the unseen. And isn't that the heart of the sea itself? A boundary that never stops moving. A skin of mystery that ripples and sings. The ocean holds our histories, our fears, our offerings. And in its turning centers, its spiral hearts, it keeps something else, some ancient awareness that we once knew and still chase. To study whirlpools is to peer into the center of the unknown. They remind us that the universe moves in circles, not lines. That the journey inward is as vast as the voyage across. that what appears to be chaos may be an order we have not yet learned to read. They teach humility. A sailor may cross oceans and chart stars, but the whirlpool cannot be mapped. It is motion without anchor, force without form, mystery without end. You cannot grasp it, you can only witness it. And sometimes be taken by it. They teach awe. In the whirl of water, there is beauty, fierce, cold, and luminous. The kind of beauty that stops thought and fills the chest. The kind that belongs not to art, but to storm and starlight. And they teach remembrance. That every culture, every people, has stood before the water and told stories. Has watched the spiral and wondered what lies at its core. Has felt, somewhere in the soul, the pull of something deep, older than breath. Perhaps that's the final truth of the whirlpool. It is not just something that swallows ships. It is something that calls us. A shape of longing. A song of descent. An invitation to look within. So if you ever stand again on a rocky shore, with the wind in your hair and the surf at your feet, and you see the water turn not away in fear. Look closer. Listen. Let the spiral speak. It may tell you a secret older than the ocean. It may tell you your own. Closing message. In the great tapestry of history and myth, the sea is more than a backdrop. It is a voice, a memory, a mirror. And in the heart of its turning waters lie the stories we have always told, of wonder, of fear, of mystery too vast for words. Whirlpools may seem like threats to navigation, but in truth, they are symbols of something deeper. They remind us that not everything can be charted. That even in the age of satellites and sonar, there are still sacred places where the world curls in on itself and whispers. Thank you for walking this quiet path with us. Through foam and fable, across forgotten maps, beneath mythic waves. Whether you listened beside the sea or in the stillness of night, may these stories stay with you. And may you carry, always, a reverence for the mysteries that turn beneath the surface. Somewhere, even now, the sea is spinning, and the spiral waits.